Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're just giving it about another minute or so, and then we are going to get started. So we'll just give about a minute for other people to join in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right. So we are going to go ahead and get started today. So I first want to welcome everybody to ALS Canada's 2023 webinar series. Today, our focus is on frontotemporal dementia and ALS. So up to 20% of people diagnosed with ALS develop cognitive changes known as FTD. So today we are joined by an amazing presenter, Maryse Raymond, who is an education coordinator from the Alzheimer Society of Simcoe County. She will discuss information about FTD and provide resources and supports that may be available across Ontario and how individuals can access those resources. So for today, please feel free to put all of your questions into the chat box function. And then what we will do is, following the presentation, we will go through each question that we receive. So to get things started, I would like to introduce Maryse from the Alzheimer Society.
Thank you so much, Emily. Like Emily said, my name is Maryse Raymond. I am one of the education coordinators with the Alzheimer Society of Simcoe County. So I recognize that many of you may not be from Simcoe County. So when I discuss services at the end, just keep in mind that depending where you live, you can access your chapter for more information. So to begin, we are going to discuss what is frontotemporal dementia. So like Emily said, if you have any questions, put them in the chat and then we'll go over them afterwards. Next slide. Perfect, awesome. So just to begin, I'm going to discuss the general term of dementia, just so everybody has an understanding of what it is, and then we'll focus on a few different types and then specifically focus on the frontotemporal dementia. So what is dementia, you may ask? Dementia is an umbrella term that describes a wide range of symptoms that are caused by disorders affecting the brain. So oftentimes people think when they hear the word dementia that the person has no short-term memory, which in fact, it's so much more than that, because our brain allows us to do everything. It is the control center of our body, and it's also the most complex organ in our body. So it's not just a memory problem, it's a brain function problem. And from that, depending what type of dementia the person is living with, depending what areas of the brain are being affected, the symptoms may change from person to person. All right, next slide. Perfect. Oh, you're on the ball, Emily. So there are three characteristics when it comes to talking about dementia. The first one is that it's degenerative. So the cells break down over time. And like I said, it will affect different areas of the brain depending on what type of dementia they're living with, how far progressed they are, and the different types, or sorry, the different symptoms that are affecting the person. It's also progressive, so the damage from the disease increases over time, and unfortunately, the symptoms gradually get worse. So oftentimes people may hear that it is a palliative diagnosis, which means that unfortunately it does not get better. And the last one is that it's irreversible. So the damage cannot be repaired. So essentially, once a brain cell dies, it does not come back. It cannot regenerate itself. And unfortunately, at the moment, there are no cures for any of the types of dementia. Excuse me. Perfect. So as you can see on your screen, it's a bit of a visual of what dementia looks like. So you have your umbrella term, and underneath there are 4 different types of dementia, but in reality, there are over 100 different types of dementia. We're not going to talk about all of them today because we'd be here for hours. Our main focus is the frontotemporal. So I'm just going to go over these 4 most common ones, just to kind of give you a better understanding of how they might differentiate from one another. And then we'll focus on the frontotemporal, or FTD. So the first, sorry, Emily, just go back. I'm just going to go over them real quick. So the first one is Alzheimer's disease, and that's the most common one. So oftentimes people think that Alzheimer's disease is the umbrella term and that dementia is a type, whereas it's the opposite. So most people might be aware of what Alzheimer's disease is, and it accounts for 60 to 80% of the cases. And it's characterized by a slow decline that affects the short-term memory, the person's ability to think, as well as their personality. The second most common one is vascular dementia, and that one accounts for about 20% of cases. And this one is caused by a blockage or decreased blood flow to the brain, so like a lack of oxygen to the brain. Oftentimes, people who have had a stroke, brain hemorrhage, traumatic brain injury, concussion, those people are at a higher risk of developing vascular dementia because they've had injury to the brain. Doesn't necessarily mean that they'll eventually have vascular dementia. Their risk level is just higher than someone who hasn't had that. Lewy body dementia is the next one. It accounts for 5 to 15% of cases, and it's often misdiagnosed because it mimics some of the same symptoms as Parkinson's disease. So the person will often have tremors, stiffness, shuffling of the feet. And the reason that it's often misdiagnosed with Parkinson's is that the cell deposits, the abnormal Lewy body deposits, are similar in both. It just depends what part of the brain is being affected. With Lewy body dementia, oftentimes the person's first common sign or symptom isn't usually short-term memory. It's usually visual hallucinations and paranoia. And then the last one, which is our focus today, is the frontotemporal dementia. So it affects the frontal lobe of the brain, which is just right at the front. We'll discuss it a little later. And this is your critical judgment, thinking, decision-making portion of your brain. It's also considered the filter of the brain. So it allows us to filter what we want to say and when we should say it, when the time is appropriate. And then it also affects your temporal lobe of the brain, which is above your ears. And that is your language and communication center of your brain. All right, now we can go to the next one. Perfect. So the reason you're here today is because you want to learn more about frontotemporal dementia. And there's quite a bit of information for me to share with you. So don't panic if this is too much. I did provide Emily with resources as well as this PowerPoint in a PDF version. So if you're looking for it afterwards, I'm assuming, maybe I'm wrong, but Emily will share with you. So
yes, I will.
Perfect. So like I said, dementia is our umbrella term, and the frontotemporal dementia falls underneath that umbrella. Now, it isn't the most common type of dementia. Like we said, it accounts for about 2 to 5% of cases, but it primarily affects the frontal lobe of the brain and our temporal lobes of the brain. And there are different types of frontotemporal dementia that a person can live with. So we'll go over those afterwards. And what happens is that the brain cells may shrink or they might enlarge. As you can see, it says with Pick's bodies, and that's a different type of frontotemporal dementia. So in both those situations, whether the brain cells shrink or they enlarge, the changes in the brain often lead to changes in behavior as well as problems with speeches. So that's what you may notice. Now we know that it's 2 to 5% of cases of dementia. However, it accounts for about 20% of those under the age of 65, so which is also known as young onset dementia. So most of the time, it affects people under that age. Yeah, I thought I wanted to add something else, but that's that for that one. So like I said, frontotemporal dementia can cause behavior changes, difficulties with speech and movement, as well as memory loss. So since the frontal and the temporal lobes of our brain are affected, oftentimes the early symptoms are the behaviors that you may notice, as well as difficulty with speech. So not necessarily the short-term memory as we saw in Alzheimer's disease. That may come later on. So usually people who live with frontotemporal dementia often remain conscious of time. So they could tell you what day it is, what year it is, where they are. And so memory isn't often a concern in the early stages. Now, when we get to the later stages, that may vary, and the general symptoms of dementia will arise. So they may be more confused and more forgetful. All right, perfect. So here is our frontal lobe of the brain. So just in the pink, as you can see, and like I said, our brain is the most complex organ in our body, so it can be overwhelming to understand everything that it does. So we're just going to break it down a little bit to help you understand better what a person living with frontotemporal dementia might experience. So the frontal lobes are our management center, and like I said, our filter of the brain. So that part of our brain is in charge of our reasoning, thinking, planning, some of our language, our emotions, judgment, motor function, movement, as well as our short-term memory. So as you can see, those are a lot of things, right? And if our frontal lobe is affected, there are many different things that can go wrong, right? So it's our executive function, and it allows us to perform certain tasks, to initiate different tasks. We use it when we follow a set of steps. So for example, if you're making a cup of tea, oftentimes we think, oh, there's like 4 or 5 steps to making a cup of tea, right? You grab your cup, you grab your tea bag, boil some water, and there you go, you have your tea. But in reality, there's over 100 different steps. And the reason that we do it so flawlessly is that our brain allows us to just go with the flow. So if this interferes, we have a harder time to use that part of our brain, and we have to pay extra attention. So we have to hold that brief information in our working memory. And if our working memory isn't working, that's when people will not be able to carry out, start, or finish certain tasks. You may also notice with the frontal lobe being affected is that filter, right? So we all have moments throughout the day where we think maybe something inappropriate or a few curse words where we're like, we probably shouldn't say this at this time. But someone who is living with frontotemporal dementia may not have that filter intact as well as it used to be, or they may not be intact at all. So you might notice that the person may swear a little more. They may be a little more inappropriate. So anything that comes to their mind comes out of their mouth, whether it's intentional or not. So you may think that the person is a little ruder, I guess you could put it that way. But more often than not, they don't even realize that they've said something. And if they do, they didn't mean it that way. It just comes and goes. So that's kind of the frontal lobe of the brain. So if we go to the next slide, I think I already touched on it a little bit, yeah. So it's our brain function. These are the functions of our brain that are affected by the frontotemporal dementia. So our executive functioning, sorry. They may have a harder time planning. So maybe making an appointment is more difficult for them because they don't know what order to put it in or how to put it in, or sometimes they may overlap appointments. Sequencing and multitasking, especially for women. That's kind of our day-to-day job. Some men do it as well, but it is proven that women are better at multitasking. So if affected by frontotemporal dementia, they will no longer be able to do more than one thing at a time. They may also have a hard time managing their emotional response, so controlling inappropriate social behavior. And they may react to a scene or to a news in an inappropriate way. So they may laugh at sad news and they have no control over that emotional portion. Their judgment or reasoning may be askewed. They might go outside in -30 weather with slippers and a house coat and not recognize that it's cold out or that they should be wearing something else. Their personality and their mood might change. And oftentimes with dementia, it's a quick sudden change. So, you could be having a conversation with them, they're happy, everything's going great, and then next thing you know, they're no longer happy or they're angry, or you're trying to wrap your head around what it is that you said, and oftentimes it's not anything that you said or did, it's just the brain or frontal lobe isn't working properly and the signals aren't being sent the way that it should throughout the body. They might have a hard time linking words to form sentences, or they might associate, excuse me, the wrong word with the wrong meaning. So you're trying to play detective and figure out what it is that they're trying to say. And the other thing is their motor function. So with dementia, we call that apraxia, and it's the inability to perform purposeful movements. So they may not be able to move their arms properly or bring their arm up to have a drink. This is where you might see the shuffling of the feet or the stiffness. They may not be able to drink as well as they should. So all of these things are controlled by our frontal lobe of the brain, which when you think about it, is quite complex, and that's quite a bit to cover. Go to the next one. Oh, so sorry. So we also said that there are changes to behavior when someone is living with frontotemporal dementia. And you may notice that the person is withdrawn or has disinhibited, sorry, my French comes out when I say this word, behavior. So losing the ability to restrain their actions. So you might notice that they're losing that initiative to do things. And it's not because they don't want to do it, it's because they don't have the ability to start that task. They don't know, let's say, how to eat a meal. Let's just say, as an example, they may not know that they have to use their hand to pick up their fork, to scoop up the food, and then to bring it to their mouth. So they need that extra help to start that activity. Or they might withdraw themselves because they're overwhelmed and they don't know how to start that task. They might lose interest in their personal hygiene. So they might not realize, that a shower every other day would be good, or that, brushing our teeth is important, things like that. And that's because they have no control over the frontal part of their brain. They might easily become distracted or repeat the same activity over and over again, right? So that attention deficit comes in here. So they might be stuck on a task for X periods of time and you can't get them away from it, or they may not be interested in anything and all they want to do is sit in a chair. Another one is like the compulsive eating. So overeating, or the unusual desire to put foreign objects in their mouth. And you may notice this especially with starchier foods, so like bread, cookies, sweeter things. So you might notice that their sweet taste buds have increased, and all they want to eat is candy, cake, cookies, the sweeter things. And again, as long as they're eating, you know, it may not be exactly what we want, but there are ways that we can work around that. And they may have incontinence or the inability to wait to go to the bathroom. And so that may not be in the early stages, but you may notice that as the disease progresses. Perfect. So that was the frontal lobe of our brain, and essentially what it's in charge of and how those changes might be affected with the frontotemporal dementia. Now our temporal lobe of the brain is located just above our ears on either side. And it's our memory center or our filing system. So again, it deals with the memory as well as the recognition of faces and objects and language. So it's our sensory input, the understanding of language, as well as creating and preserving conscious and long-term memories. So oftentimes, as I mentioned in the beginning, the person's short-term memory is not typically the first symptom that you'll see with frontotemporal dementia. Oftentimes, they may forget their long-term memories or things like that because their temporal lobe is affected. And so they may have a harder time linking older stories, or if you compare it to Alzheimer's disease, oftentimes they live in their long-term memory, so they're able to tell you stories from like 60 years ago or when they were in their 20s. But with this one, oftentimes it's the opposite. They aren't able to remember their long-term memories, but their short-term memories are intact. So if we go to the next one, perfect. This is what might be impaired in our brain functions for someone who's living with frontotemporal dementia in their temporal lobe. So again, object recognition, including faces. So they may not put, I guess you could say, 2 and 2 together, and they may not recognize different people or associate the face with the name of the person. They may not recognize certain objects or what they're used for, especially if, you know, it's an older object that they haven't used in a while. I don't know, maybe they don't recognize what the microwave's for, or what a coffee machine does, things like that, they may not recognize. Relating appropriate emotions to events and objects. So they don't have the ability to properly understand the information being given to them. So their emotion to those news or to that event, let's say somebody got in a car accident, isn't going to be the appropriate response. So if you say, you know, your loved one, any loved one got into a car accident, they're not doing well, they're in a hospital, they may laugh or just be like, oh, that's great. So whereas usually somebody would be sad, they'd be crying, they may not associate the proper emotional response. They may also have a harder time speaking, reading, writing, and especially understanding the meaning of the words being heard. So they hear you, they hear the words, but their brain isn't able to register what the meaning of those words are. So you might say, you know, why don't you help me empty the dishwasher after dinner? And they'll say, yeah, no problem. They heard you, they answered, but the brain wasn't able to understand what those words meant. They just recognized that somebody was talking to them, and their tone of voice posed a question, and so they answered. But you notice that they didn't move or they didn't come help load or unload the dishwasher like you asked. And so not the hearing, but the brain not being able to understand or register that information. You may also notice that their speech might be skewed, or They might fill in the blanks with different words, or they can't think of the word, so they explain it. And then again, you're playing detective and trying to figure out what it is that they're saying. They may also not be able to read or write, or their reading or writing might not be the level that it should be. And then remembering new information might be a little harder for them as well. We go to the next slide. These are a few of the changes that might happen to the person's speech. So they might start speaking less, maybe simpler sentences, or, there's missing a few words in the sentence, or because their brain isn't able to register and create those sentences, they might speak less, or they might not speak at all. So they tend to step away from that, and their brain kind of just isn't able to send out how they should speak or the way that word should come out. They might have a hard time finding the right words or even describing themselves or somebody else. If you ask them to describe something, they might not know how to describe it, right? So if you were to say, oh, describe this water bottle to me, they might not be able to tell you that it has a straw, or that it's yellow, or that it has a handle, or what its use is, right? They might not recognize that it contains water and that a person should drink from it. They might repeat what has already been said by others. And so that might be to understand better what somebody else said, or it could be that their brain wasn't able to register, and so they repeated that word. And sometimes they might be stuck repeating the same thing over and over again. Maybe it's a word, or maybe it's a story. And it can be frustrating as a care partner to understand, well, they've already told me, why are they saying it again? But to them, their brain is saying, well, you haven't told this story yet, so you've got to tell them. And their brain is saying that that's the very first time that they're telling the story every time they retell the story. They might start stuttering or stumbling over certain words. They may have difficulty sustaining a train of thought or maintaining the conversation. So if you're in a group setting and let's say 3 or 4 or 5 people are having a conversation, and suddenly one person goes off topic and then comes back on, the person living with the frontotemporal dementia won't be able to follow that conversation because there's too much information being provided, and their brain isn't able to follow that information. And then I added aphasia at the end, and that's just the inability to be able to verbalize, to speak. So essentially encompassing all of the things that we just discussed. So again, a few other symptoms that come with frontotemporal dementia involves movement, anything around movement. So the person might have dystonia, which is abnormal postures of hands and feet. So they may not walk properly, they may walk outwardly or inwardly, and their hands might be in closed positions, and they might stiffen. And so they may have a harder time holding on to things or opening their hands or walking in a straight line, which leads me to the gait disorder. So shuffling while they're walking, not being able to lift up their feet, which then leads to more frequent falls. And then again, with the hands, they may have tremors, and not just the hands, it could be any part of their body. Again, working hand in hand with Parkinson's disease, but also with ALS and that neurodegenerative, those neurons not working properly. And they may be a little clumsier, so having a harder time holding on to objects, using smaller objects. So for example, buttoning up their shirt, doing up the zipper on their pants or on a jacket. They might not be able to hold on to it. So that's kind of perhaps, we often say that dementia doesn't have a physical look to it, but with frontotemporal dementia, because of the parts of the brain it's affecting, movement does become skewed. And then if we go to the next slide, our emotions or the person's emotions are also a factor with frontotemporal dementia. So I mentioned this before, but they might be exhibiting apathy, which is the lack of interest, drive, or initiative to start that activity. So that get up and go in our brain that tells us, hey, it's a beautiful day outside to go for a walk, is not intact in someone who's living with frontotemporal dementia. So they don't have the ability to start an activity. So as a care partner, it would be our duty to ask them to do these things to help them get started. They may not want to, so that's fine. You ask again a little later. And once they're doing that activity, if you can get them to do it, they're having a great time. And you're like, well, why don't you do that more often? And they quite literally can't. Their brain isn't allowing them. Again, they may have a flat or exaggerated improper emotion. So like I said, their emotions may be expressed at the wrong time or for the wrong circumstances, or just the wrong emotion altogether, right? You could say, oh, there's a new baby in the family, your granddaughter had a baby, I guess, or your daughter, whoever it may be, and they might be angry. And you're like, well, this is good news. But then you tell them about a car accident and somebody's not doing well, and they're laughing or they're happy. So the emotions don't correlate with the news being given to them or the information provided. They'll have a harder time reading social signals. So our body language plays a big factor in our communication. It's actually 55% of the way we communicate. But with frontotemporal dementia, they have a harder time reading those social cues, or when somebody is being sarcastic in a conversation, they aren't able to pick up or understand what it means. They might take it quite literally. So if you're trying to make jokes or things like that, they may not catch on. And that's the fact that they have a hard time reading those social signals, those social cues. They may have a lack of empathy, towards others. So they may not recognize what other people are going through and how hard it might be on other people. So for example, their care partner, let's say it's a couple and the husband has frontotemporal dementia. He may not realize the impact that the disease is having on his wife as well, caring for him, helping him out. And so he's not empathetic and he thinks, well, why is it hard for you? You're not the one living with it, or things like that. They don't recognize that other people might be having a hard time as well. And then they'll have a loss of insight or self-awareness. So the inability to recognize changes with themselves. And with dementia, we call that anosognosia. So quite literally, they don't know that they don't know. They may not recognize that there's anything going on with them, so that when somebody addresses the situation or says, hey, this isn't going well, or, you didn't do that right, they don't believe it. They'll often say, well, I think you're the one that has a problem, or how dare you tell me this? So they don't recognize or have insight within themselves about themselves. So those are essentially kind of the warning signs, symptoms that you might see within someone living with frontotemporal dementia. And I always tell people, when you encounter someone who's living with dementia, it's the very first time no, that's not how I want to say it. I apologize. Let me backtrack here. So when you meet someone living with dementia, you've only met one person living with dementia, in the sense that everyone is so unique and individual as a person typically. But living with a type of dementia, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone living with frontotemporal dementia will exhibit the same symptoms or they're going to progress the same way. So I always say to people, yes, I've given you all the warning signs and symptoms, but keep in mind that someone living with dementia might exhibit certain symptoms in their early stages, and then it might change in their middle stages, and then in their late stages. Or some symptoms might interlap. You may never even notice some of these symptoms or have to experience them. So just keeping in mind that when you meet one person living with dementia, you've only met one person living with dementia. All right. I feel like I'm going a little fast. I'm going to try to slow it down a little. But there's just so much good information to share with you. So, frontotemporal dementia, people might refer it to frontotemporal disorders. There are a couple different ones that may impact a person. And so we'll go over a few of them. There's a 3, 4, 5, I think 7. And again, that's a prime example of saying when you meet one person living with dementia, you've only met one person, because yes, frontotemporal dementia is kind of that mini umbrella of its own because it encompasses different types of frontotemporal dementias. And so the first ones are frontotemporal dementias with progressive language declines. So you may notice it as PPA, so primary progressive aphasia, and that the logopenic PPA is one of the most common ones, and the person will have a hard time finding the right words while speaking. They might hesitate or pause in their speech. So it might be harder to have a conversation with those people or to understand what they're saying. So the aphasia impacts the language. So all of these, if someone is living with one of these types of frontotemporal dementia, their speech is often affected before their behavior. The next one is progressive non-affluent aphasia, and it omits, the person might omit words that link nouns and verbs, such as to, from, the, so that might be missing from those sentences. And then again, as a care partner, family, friend, you might have to play detective and figure out, okay, what is it that they're trying to say? And with the progressive non-affluent aphasia, the person may also have difficulty swallowing because of the way that it's affecting their brain and sending the signals to their body, which in this case, those living with this might have to have thickened foods and thickened fluids in order for them to be able to swallow better. Semantic dementia, if someone is living with this one, they can't understand words or recognize familiar people or objects. So if you're having a conversation with them, they may not recognize what those words mean, or recognize who you are or where they are or any objects around them. So just keeping that in mind. If we go to the next one, so we talked about the ones that affect the language, so the aphasia. These ones affect the progressive motor decline, so any movement and things like that. So the first one is your corticobasal degeneration. So a person living with this type of frontotemporal dementia might have muscle, oh my God, rigidity. Here we go. So they might be very stiff. So their arms might be straight, or they may have their hands in fists. They have a hard time using smaller objects or manipulating certain things. They'll have a hard time closing buttons, even operating simple appliances. And again, they may have difficulty swallowing because their muscles are being rigid, so their throat muscles might harden as well. And then they'll have a harder time with language, and spatial orientation might arise with their issues. The next one is the progressive supranuclear palsy. And with this one, it's a progressive problem of balance and walking. So now, typically, that would be in the person's cerebellum, which is in the back of the brain underneath the occipital lobe. So again, linking with the temporal lobe and towards the back. So they'll have a problem with balance and walking. So you may notice that they may not be able to have proper gait, or they might not be able to walk in a straight line, or they're kind of leaning towards the side when they're walking. It may also look as if they kind of have a drunken stance, you know, when people kind of go all over the place, which is why sometimes it's often misdiagnosed as well, right? Because people think, well, maybe, you know, they just had too much to drink or whatever the situation may be. when in reality, it's their brain not working properly. Their movements will be slower and they may fall more, as well as that body stiffness may become evident. And they might have restricted eye movement. So they may not be able to move their eyes as well, which again, that leads into your occipital lobe, where that's your vision center. So again, it is frontotemporal dementia, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's just in the frontal lobe and temporal lobe, but those are the main lobes that are impacted with this type of dementia. So if we go on to the next slide, in continuation with our motor decline frontotemporal dementia, we have it with Parkinsonisms. So I did mention earlier that the Lewy body dementia also mimicked Parkinsonism, but so does FTD in certain cases. And so the movement might become problematic, similar to that of Parkinson's disease. So like I said, stiffness, shuffling, slowed movements, and you might notice changes in their behavior and language. And oftentimes it's sudden, right? Especially in behavior. So the person might be more anxious or more nervous, or whatever the situation may be, that is amplified. And then FTD with ALS, so the amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which is why we've partnered up, or why Emily actually asked me to do a presentation on frontotemporal dementia, because it does impact, or it can, I should say, impact those living with ALS as well. And it's about 20% of frontotemporal dementia cases. So those living with frontotemporal dementia, only about 20%. And that's still a pretty high number, are impacted by FTD as well as ALS. And so it's the changes in behavior and language, and the muscle weakness and loss. So they may not be able to do certain things, or because their brain and our spinal cord is attached, and that is the neurological disease, they may not be able to control their voluntary movements, right? So fine jerks or wiggling in the muscles, chewing, walking, talking, all of those muscles, the brain loses the connections with them. And so, like I said, that then in turn leads people to losing their ability to walk, talk, eat, and unfortunately, eventually breathe. Hopefully I'm not going too fast. I know it's a lot of information to take in, but like I said, questions are more than welcome to be asked, and Emily will share plenty of information with you afterwards. So the progression of frontotemporal dementia will vary from person to person. And again, like I said, when you meet one person living with dementia, you've only met one person living with dementia. When we talk about statistics for frontotemporal dementia, they say that the average length is about 2 to 10 years. Now take that with a grain of salt. It is a ballpark number, and that's just the estimated time length. They also say that the average diagnosis is around 57 years old. And so regarding genetics, people are often worried that it's hereditary. And so there's two answers to that. It's that one, 60% of it is sporadic, which means that there are no known causes to the frontotemporal dementia. There's no rhyme or reason as to why someone is living with it. However, 40% of it is hereditary or familial, in the sense that it could be a combination of genetics and their environmental factor. So just keeping that in mind, there are genetic testings, and we'll talk about the diagnosis a little later on, that you can see if it does run in your family. You can get it tested and see if you carry that specific gene that carries the FTD from generation to generation. So we talked about the different types of frontotemporal dementia, and we also talked about generically the symptoms and warning signs. So in the early stages, people often have one type of symptom, whether it's problems with language or behavior changes, right? And as the disease progresses, as the frontotemporal dementia progresses, and more areas of the brain become affected, that's when you'll see symptoms tend to overlap and appear simultaneously. So usually, like I said, in the beginning, it's one symptom. As it progresses, you'll notice it more. In the early stages, a person's memory and orientation of time and space often remains intact. And it's subtle changes that emerge over time, so very gradually. If we move to the middle stages, it involves a more rapidly emerging series of changes over a briefer time course, right? So a person might be in the early stages for long periods of time, but once they enter the middle stage, things tend to progress a little bit faster. In the middle stages, the person living with frontotemporal dementia may rely on others much more for their activities of daily living. So, brushing their teeth, their hair, getting dressed, cooking, making a cup of coffee, as well as their independent activities of daily living. Getting places, doing chores outside the house, mowing the lawn, things like that, doing billing, anything to do with numbers and things like that. And then unfortunately, in the later stages, they're quite dependent on everyone else for their daily needs. They may have a harder time eating independently or getting dressed independently. So they require more assistance. This is oftentimes where you might see people going into long-term care and needing that 24/7 help. And their mobility is significantly reduced. And in the later stages, kind of middle to late stages, is where the more general symptoms of dementia appear. So the forgetfulness, the disorientation of time and space. So you'll notice that it's not just your main symptoms of language or behavior, but that umbrella term that we talked about at the beginning will really start to play a factor here. So I always like to tell people that you can live well while living with dementia. And it's often easier in the early stages because for the most part, people are still aware of their surroundings. They're able to do certain things. And so there are strategies that we can help the people living with dementia to live well while living with dementia, right? So we're going to have to adapt. We're going to have to change. And as a care partner, family member, friend, it's important to recognize that the person living with dementia is not able to change. And so we have to be the change and we have to be there to help them. So we can use the strategy of validation to help those living with dementia. And so validation doesn't necessarily involve agreeing or disagreeing with the person. It involves listening to the person without adding our own reality. Because oftentimes the person living with dementia may not be living in the same reality as we are because their brain isn't working properly. And so their perception may not be the same as we are. Oftentimes we'll say, well, don't you remember this? Or, we're trying to get too many things out of them or trying to get them to remember rather than being present and using our active listening skills, right? Our communication helps that person to express themselves. So as an example, if someone is looking for their mother, right, they might have that repeated action of saying, where's my mom? Where's my mom? I need to go home. You can simply answer and say, I see you're thinking of your mother. What's her name? Tell me about her. And so it's kind of a validation and a distraction so that they can help you understand what they're looking for. And it kind of changes their train of thought to something else. Validation also involves repeating words and movement, paraphrasing or mirroring their expressions, right? Sometimes we don't have to speak. Sometimes it's that gentle touch or just being there for the person and helping them feel comfortable. You want to provide that safe space for them. And so by mirroring their words or expression, it helps to show your connection with that person, rather than, asking too many questions or overstepping or stressing them out in the sense that they may not recognize what it is that they're asking you or what they're looking for. And so we try to avoid those questions of, do you remember? Or there's open-ended questions. So we kind of try to ask gentler questions, close-ended questions, so that it's not a tricky conversation. It's a very simple conversation. And if we go to the next slide, it's just the strategies of the 3 R's. And using this in this order can help the person feel more reassured, right? So we're recognizing what it is that they're telling us. We're validating that. We're reassuring them of the situation, right? So if they say, oh, I want to go home, I want to go home, we're not talking about taking them home, but, asking them, recognizing, I understand that, but, tell me about your place. Tell me about your home, and reassuring them that they're in a safe place, because oftentimes that's what they're looking for, is to know that they're safe. And then by doing so and by using our active listening skills, we might be able to distract them into another location or another topic and discuss something else and kind of veer away from that. And along with that strategy, there are other things that might be beneficial and not so beneficial when interacting, having that conversation with someone living with frontotemporal dementia. And on our to-do list, the very first thing, and sometimes I hate that it's there, but it's always a good reminder to treat the person as an adult. Unfortunately, I've seen it too many times where someone will unfortunately treat the person differently, I guess I could put it. And they may treat them as a child rather than an adult, which is demeaning to the person. And they are typically older than we are. They've lived their lives. So why are we diminishing everything that they've done in life, right? So it's important to treat them as an adult, talk to them as an adult, include them in conversations, make them feel a part of the situation. It's important to provide a calm environment as well. If there are too many things going on when you're having a conversation or when you're doing an activity, the person will easily be distracted, and that can arise some responsive behaviors. And those are things we try to avoid, because then our situation becomes bigger than it should be. It's important to simplify instructions, right? So rather than having 6 steps to something, we're going to do it 1 step at a time. Let's say we want to go for a walk. That's how we're going to start. Let's go for a walk. We'll say, sure, hoping they say sure or yes. Then you'll say, let's go put your coat on. Give them time to put their coat on. If you see that they're struggling, ask, would you like some help? Once that one task of putting the coat on is done, we move on to the next task. Let's put your shoes on. So by simplifying and only giving one instruction at a time, it allows the person to do it properly and not be stressed, right? So if we went in and said, let's go for a walk, put your shoes, put your boots, put your coat, whatever it is on, and let's leave. You lost them at let's go for a walk, because that was overwhelming and that was way too much for them to process. It's important to establish a familiar routine. So routine is key. You may notice it in your life. The more you have a routine, the more things go smoothly, because you know what to expect next. You know what's going to happen. Same with someone living with dementia. The more that they do a routine, the more capable and independent they can be for longer periods of time, right? So if it's the same thing every single day, might be redundant to you as a care partner, But to the person living with dementia, it's very important and structural to their life. Offer reassurances. They're humans like anybody else, and because their brain isn't working properly and not sending the proper signals, oftentimes anxiety plays a big part in their day-to-day life because they have no control over their brain or sometimes how their body is working. So if we offer that reassurance, that guidance, it allows them to just feel safe, and you want to provide them a safe place. Being patient and flexible is extremely important. And again, we're all human. None of us are superheroes. And we live day by day. Nobody has an instruction book written saying, if you do this, it will go well. And everyone is unique, right? So exercising that patience and being flexible, understanding that things may not always go the way that we had planned. Or, we wanted to do this today and the person living with dementia isn't having a good day. So we're not going to go out for a drive because you know that it's not going to go well. So understanding that plans might change, and as the disease progresses, things will be different. And support the person's remaining strengths. That's extremely important because they're already losing so much of themselves that you want to focus on the remaining strengths. If they're able to do something, allow them to do it rather than just taking over. And I know sometimes it's easier to say, I'll just do it, don't worry about it. But we're taking away those remaining strengths. And so they'll lose them quicker than if we allow them the chance to do it. Yeah, it might take a little longer, but at least they're still able to do those things. And here's our to not do list. And again, I may have already kind of talked about these, but do not speak to the person as if they're a child, right? They're an adult, they've lived a full life, they know a lot of things. Their brain just isn't working properly. It's not their fault, it's not them, it's the disease's fault. Do not argue, correct, or attempt to reason with the person. Again, their brain isn't working properly, it's not sending the proper signals to their body, and they might not be living in the same reality that we are. Do not yell or scold the person. Sometimes the way that they behave or the words that come out of their mouth are not appropriate, but that's not their fault. It's the disease. It's the way that it's affecting the brain and the way that the brain is sending the signals to the rest of their body. They often won't even realize what they've said or what they've done because their brain just tells them to do it. And the last thing not to do is don't give up on the person. They didn't choose to live with dementia. They didn't choose to have their brain not work properly. Be there and make sure to offer that support. So the next thing we'll talk about is how do we get that diagnosis? How do we go from, noticing the signs and symptoms to getting an official diagnosis? And it's important to keep in mind that the diagnosis is often a process of elimination and can take a long time. So as you can see on the screen, it says no single test can tell if a person has a type of dementia. And I wish I could. I wish I could give you a golden answer, one test to say, this is the type of dementia you have, this is what you have to do. So not a single test can tell you if you're living with frontotemporal dementia. What they do is a process of elimination. And the reason that they do that is to eliminate or rule out any other problems that might be going on within the person. So again, for example, frontotemporal dementia is often misdiagnosed with multiple different things. Could be Parkinson's, could be ALS, could be depression because they have similar symptoms. So typically you'll notice the signs and symptoms. And again, keeping in mind that every person is different. We've talked about a variety of different symptoms. So once you notice those symptoms, make a doctor's appointment. Doctors typically will diagnose frontotemporal dementia by identifying a series of characteristic features while ruling out any other possible cause, right? So they'll start off with that initial assessment. So family history, did your mother have frontotemporal dementia or any type of dementia? Grandmother, all of those things, family history, your medical history, recent history. So what's going on in your life, family-wise, career-wise, everything. They want to get that global picture, that big picture. Excuse me. And then they'll do a cognitive test. So whether it's the MOCA test, or the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, or the MMSE, which is the mini mental state exam, to have that baseline and assess how the brain functions or how the brain functions are affected. And then they might send you for a variety of different tests, imaging, things like that. So oftentimes the MRI is useful and helpful in making a diagnosis of frontotemporal dementia because you can often see the lesions. But they might send you for blood work, CAT scan, EKG, ECG, anything they think that might be a factor within that person's life to make sure they're ruling everything out, that there's nothing else going on that is mimicking a sign of dementia. And so once they've gotten that, or even if you're in the process of receiving a diagnosis or you're getting tested, you can connect with the Alzheimer's Society. So you don't need a doctor's referral to connect with us, any society across Ontario. You can call and say, I'm in the process of getting a diagnosis, my spouse, my aunt, my mom, my aunt, family member. You can even just call us and say, I'd like to get more information about dementia, and we'd be more than happy to help you. You can also have your doctor refer you. So there's a couple avenues in which you can connect with the Alzheimer's Society. And from there, we would help you navigate the journey from beginning to end, provide you with education, different resources, that support from a family support coordinator, recreation programs, you name it, we have a lot to offer, which we'll discuss a little later on. Oftentimes, your family doctor may refer you to a specialist that is more inclined to understand the dementia, what it might be doing. So oftentimes a gerontologist or a neurologist to help along with the journey. And then the last step, which is extremely important, is to create that care plan. So what is this going to look like if someone is living with dementia? Who is part of your support circle? What is the care plan in the early stages, in the middle stages, late stages? Are we going to long-term care? Are we going to have home assistance? Are the neighbors helping? Are we sharing our diagnosis with people? And it's important to keep in mind not to do it alone. You're not alone, and you're going to need support during this journey, and we're here to help you. And so if we go on to the next slide, before we jump into our programs and services that we have to offer at the Alzheimer's Society, I just want to touch on the treatment options. And at present, unfortunately, like we said earlier, there is no cure for any type of dementia, and there's no effective way to slow down the progression of frontotemporal dementia. And so, unfortunately, there is no specific medication for any of the FTD types. Whereas with Alzheimer's disease, there are a few different medication types. FTD does not have any specific ones. And again, those medications used for Alzheimer's disease are not effective on the FTD as it targets different areas of the brain. But there are medications that can be prescribed to help with frontotemporal dementia, and they might help reduce agitation, oh my goodness, can't say the word at the moment, and depression might often be prescribed to help with certain symptoms of dementia. And it's important to learn as much as possible about the disease to help understand and respond to the person's new behaviors, because you might notice different things, different symptoms, behavior as it goes on, and that will help with the symptom management. And then if we go to the next slide, these are non-medical approaches to treatment options. Physical activity is very helpful, right? What's good for the heart is good for the brain. So I'm not saying, sign up for a marathon or, swim 20 kilometers. Just be mindful of being physically active. Go for a walk or do seated exercises if you're not interested in going for a long walk. A bike, a recumbent bike, chair yoga, there are different things to stay active. I even tell people sometimes cleaning is physically active, right? Add a little bit of a stretch when you're dusting atop things, or squat down when you're cleaning. Just little things into your day-to-day life. You may have access to personalized music to help improve mood and behavior, which is one of the services that we can provide at the Alzheimer's Society. But music has shown to be extremely helpful in dementia, and it's one of the last things to go. So if someone loves music, that might be an important factor in their day life. And then person-centered activities that emphasize their current strengths and abilities that can improve their quality of life, right? If they don't like to, I don't know, play cards, you're not going to force them to play cards. But if they're an avid chess player, let's say, maybe we're going to play chess with them. Maybe you're learning to play chess, and that way you're using that activity. They like to fold towels, let them fold towels. It may not be the way that you like those towels to be folded, but it keeps them active and it allows them to use their remaining abilities, right? So if, as a care partner or family member, you may need to seek support and learn coping strategies to work around the person's behavior rather than trying to change the person themselves, because they have no control over that. And that's where us as the Alzheimer's Society may come in to help you. So if you go to the next slide, I recognize again that some of you may be in Simcoe County and some of you may not be in Simcoe County. So there are multiple different chapters across Ontario, multiple Alzheimer's Society chapters that offer a variety of different programs and services, different support services, education, and social recreation. So if you are not from the Simcoe County region, and you're not sure where your closest local society is, please feel free to ask. I'm more than happy to help. You can also just type into Google whatever city or town you live in, Alzheimer's Society close to, if you're living in London, or if you're living in, I don't know, Matheson up north, right? So wherever you are, you can type it in and it will likely prompt you to the closest Alzheimer's Society. Also, if you type in alzheimerssociety.ca, in the, I believe it's the top left corner, there's a drop-down menu where you can pick in Ontario which society you want to look at. So that may provide you with more information regarding that society. But overall, these are some of the things that the Alzheimer's Society may provide for you to help you with your dementia journey. So whether you're the person living with dementia, the care partner, or I should say primary care partners, some people are care partners from afar, family members, friends, or even just the general public that wants to know more. So we have support services that can be offered. There are First Link Care Navigators or family support coordinators that will be your go-to person. They're the person that you'll connect with for any type of support, navigation through your journey, and they'll help you with one-on-one counseling, refer you and inform you about additional services that we may not be able to provide, but that are within the community. And they're kind of your go-to. Anything changes, you call them and say, you know, this new responsive behavior is what we're exhibiting. You know, how do we go about it? Do you have any tips and strategies? So they're kind of that go-to person. There are also support groups, often for care partners. Some societies even have them for the people living with dementia. And it's to help those experience emotional relief and connect with others that are experiencing a similar journey, and allows them to know that they're not alone, right? They're able to talk about the different things that they're experiencing. Some people might have other strategies or tips and tricks that will help them along the way. Some societies also have the Enhancing Care program. We do have it in Simcoe County, and I like to call that the extended support group. So it allows care partners to focus on certain behaviors, responsive behaviors that the person living with dementia may have, and allow them to understand why they might be experiencing it. Some of the programs might have a simulated patient where they can practice the behavior and strategies so that they can use that at home. We have also a variety of different education, and COVID has allowed us to move to Zoom and access people across Ontario, across Canada, which I guess is what we're doing today, in order to provide education to everyone. So, you know, if it's on Zoom, most times if you're not in that certain chapter, you can still access it because it might be available to the public. So depending on what it is, there are learning series for the care partners and those living with dementia, as well as registered education. There are also public educations that we provide just to allow people to understand more about dementia and to raise that awareness. And some of us also go to health fairs, again, to raise that awareness and provide information and to tell people that, you know, we're out there and we're here to help those living with dementia or those encountering dementia in your life. There are, in fact, the statistics are 1 in 10 people over the age of 65 are living with a type of dementia, and then 1 in 3 over 85 are living with a type of dementia. And then if we move over to our social recreation, again, those are the programs we offer in Simcoe County. So again, check within your chapter to see what they might be offering. But I do believe most chapters offer Minds in Motion. It's a registered program, and it's an 8-week session, 2 hours a week for the care partner and the person living with dementia. And it goes over exercises and then cognitively stimulating activities. And it also allows people to connect with one another and kind of make new friendships, new, oh my God, what's the word I want to use? New collaborations, new interactions across this journey, right? To recognize that no, they're not alone. And yes, there are other people going through similar things that could help one another. You may have musical programs or musical memories. Here in Simcoe County, we've partnered with musical therapists to provide music virtually to our clients so they can sing along. The Alzheimer Society of Toronto has a program called the Music Project. Many other societies other chapters jump in on this program where you fill out a form, the person living with dementia's musical interest, and the Music Project will send an MP3 player or music player with headphones and a list of music that the person can listen to. So it's a really great program. There may also be art programs within your region. We have a couple here in Simcoe County in partnership with local art communities that provide an instructor, and it's for the client and person living with dementia, where they'll just do different art projects with the instructors, and then they get to take it home afterwards. So again, another way to interact and connect with other people. And then some societies also have in-home recreation therapy. We have it in Simcoe County, and ours is a 12-week program, an hour and a half each week, where our recreation therapists will go in and spend that time with the person living with dementia. And so doing, person-centered activities, stimulating that person based on their needs, abilities, and interests. And it also provides the care partner with a bit of respite time to do anything and everything that they would like. So that pretty much wraps all of the information that I have for you. My last slide is just the information for Simcoe County. So if you want that information, I also provided Emily with the link for, I think I did. If not, it's just alzheimer.ca, and then you can pick your local chapter. But I do hope that this session was oh my goodness, I've talked too much, informative and beneficial for you. And I hope that I was able to provide a bit of insight on frontotemporal dementia and what the Alzheimer's Society have to offer.
That was amazing, Maryse. I do have a few questions that were posted,
Perfect.
so I would like to go through that. You actually answered a few of the questions specifically around genetics and FTD and the link between ALS and FTD. There's also for the participants, there's also some really good information about links between ALS and FTD that are posted on als.ca. So there are some blog posts that I would be happy to share out, and so that people have more of that information. But there is a few questions. One in particular is about communication. So from Catherine, so in advanced stages of ALS, the patient would use a speech device to communicate. How do we help someone with FTD to communicate, as they aren't able to follow a sequence of steps to produce the response from the speech device?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, as the disease progresses, unfortunately, the verbal communication becomes very minimal. And so the nonverbal communication kind of kicks in, right? So the body language might be prominent. So the person living with dementia's body language is important, but also our body language as care partners, family, friends is also important, right? So as their memory, starts to change, their emotional memory is one of the memories that is most intact. So they may not remember what we said, but they'll always remember how we made them feel, right? So if you've had like a bad day and you go in to spend time with your loved one that's living with dementia, and you're kind of, not your happy-go-lucky self, and you're trying to hide it, but they can sense that something's off, they're going to remember that the next time you go. So I always try to tell people, if you're not having a good day, don't go visit, or figure it out before you go visit, because they'll sense that. In the early stages, they're still often able to communicate fairly well. You may have to fill in the blanks as the disease progresses and become that detective. Unfortunately, in the later stages, communication oftentimes is not, the verbal communication anyways, is not present. So you often say that the nonverbal is most important. So we think that we always have to verbally communicate with people, and sometimes it's just being there and being present, right? Communication can be touch, or it can be, just sitting there with that person, allowing them to know that you're present and that you're there for them. So sometimes it's an inner battle with ourselves, because it's frustrating for us that they can't speak. But usually in the later stages, the person living with dementia does not even recognize that that is an issue for them. And so just providing that support and that nonverbal approach of love and sometimes touch, and just, being there with them. and it's sometimes being comfortable with being uncomfortable, if that makes sense. I hope I
That's
answered
great.
the question.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it's also something as things continue. I know that with ALS Canada, we always push individuals to go back to their speech language pathologist, whether that's in their community or in at one of the ALS clinics, to talk about forms of communication and strategies that may work for individuals. And I know that Maryse has said it multiple times as well, is it is so very individualized, and we say that about ALS also. Everyone's experiences are so different, so the way that we manage those experiences are different, and the solutions that we come up with. So that's
Yeah.
amazing. Thank you. So I have a few
And
more
Emily,
questions.
I
Yeah.
just wanted to touch on oftentimes in the early stages or in the early diagnosis, doctors may recommend a speech pathologist to the person living with frontotemporal dementia, and it may help in the early stages, but just keeping in mind that as the disease progresses, it may no longer be beneficial.
So I have another question. I have a question from Kathy. So does FTD affect an individual's ability to recognize their limitations or changes in their abilities?
Yeah, so in the early stages, again, everything is so individualized, but oftentimes in the early stages, the person may recognize their limitations to a certain extent. But as the disease progresses, they no longer recognize that they're able to do or not able to do certain things. So they may become very frustrated in the early to mid stages, but after that, they may no longer recognize that aspect.
So I have another one from Kathy as well. So does FTD affect an individual's ability to hyper focus on something? So a direct quote from Kathy, I call it getting stuck in his brain to the point of obsessive.
Yeah. Yeah, so that goes along with one of our 8As, which is the attention deficit portion. So there are two extremes to it. So it could be whether the person is hyper focused, where you can't get their attention off of anything and that's the only thing that they're focused on, or they may not have any attention span, like they can't focus on anything at all. So again, it's those two extremes, right? So if they're focused on something at hand, it's recognizing, okay, when does it become too much? And then how do we approach that situation? So I like her quote, and that's essentially how it is. You're kind of stuck in that mindset.
All right, perfect. Thank you. I hope we're answering everyone's questions. If any questions are coming up while we're talking, please definitely put it in the chat or in the question function, and I will make sure we get to that.
And
Another
Emily,
question. Yeah.
sorry. When you send out that information, please feel free to send my email address along. If anybody has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them or send them resources that they might be looking for.
Perfect. Thank you. That's always great to know, because I know questions do come up after the fact.
Absolutely.
Usually when we leave, that's when more questions come up. So
Yeah.
the final question that we have is from Kathy, and she talks about her experience with getting help and how she wasn't originally referred to the Alzheimer's Society for her husband. So what is being done to encourage doctors to refer to the Alzheimer's Society?
That is a very great question, and I can't speak on behalf of other chapters or other societies. Um, but within Simcoe County, I do know that myself as an education coordinator, along with my manager and one of our first line care navigators, we are working at reaching out to the family health teams in order to let them know and provide them with information to say, you know, if you have a patient that is diagnosed or in the process of getting diagnosed with a type of dementia, we have all of this information available, because it shocks me. It shouldn't anymore, but every time I do a presentation, or almost every time, a lot of people are like, I had no idea you guys had so much to offer. So we're trying our best to get that word out and to let people know that we're here, that we have so much to offer. It's not just, you know, I have Alzheimer's disease. That's it. And sometimes I know because the name is the Alzheimer's Society, people deter from it because, well, I'm living with dementia, not Alzheimer's disease. We help everyone within that umbrella term of dementia. Um, and I always tell people, if you're a part of a group, if you own a business, anything like that, the more information, the better it is. So we're always willing and able to do presentations, whether it's in person, via Zoom, provide that information and ensure that people know that, the Alzheimer's Society is here and that we're here to help others. So our goal as the Alzheimer's Society of Simcoe County is to really get into those family health teams and doctors' offices to provide that information so that they know that, we're here to help along the way.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much. So it comes to the end of our questions. I hope that we answered everything. Maryse, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us. It's
My
been
pleasure.
very informative, and it's definitely a lot of information, but it's a lot of great information because we do see a lot of the similarities. We can see how FTD and ALS can be linked, and also just the similarities of accessing services, programs available.
Absolutely.
So it's amazing. And I've gotten a lot of great feedback, a lot of thank yous.
Good.
And so, a lot of very informative, very helpful, which is awesome. So I just wanted to let everybody know we will have this session recording up on ALS Canada's website under our resources page, as well as on our YouTube page. So keep an eye on that. It's usually up within the next few days. If there's any questions, please feel free to connect with community services at als.ca, and we will share additional resources for anybody who is interested. Maryse has included a PDF with all of her slides, which is great. So if anybody has any questions and they want to reach out, please do so at communityservices@als.ca. So I want to thank everyone for joining. Thank you, Maryse. And we hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.